In the world of chess, there are games that go down in history simply because they seem impossible when masters find themselves in seemingly hopeless situations. That's when chess magic truly begins to reveal itself in all its glory. For example, in New York in 1972, Bobby Fischer faced Boris Spassky in the final match for the World Championship title. In one of the games when Fischer's position looked desperate, almost every observer was convinced that victory was already in Spassky's hands. Everyone expected him to capitulate, but Fischer found a hidden resource-solid pawns on the king side and an unexpected piece sacrifice. After a series of precise moves, Spassky was unable to convert his advantage. The game ended in a draw, and Fischer firmly cemented his reputation as an unpredictable genius. But even more fantastic seems the famous match between Garry Kasparov and Veslan Topalov in Linares in 1999. Playing white, Kasparov took a risk on move 24 by sacrificing a bishop to open up an attacking line against his opponent's king. Many commentators were convinced that this move would lead to defeat, but Kasparov began to find unexpected moves again and again, step by step turning what seemed to be a lost position into a breathtaking victory. His rook sacrifice on move 33 is still considered one of the most beautiful in history. Thanks to lightning-fast calculations, he managed to trap his opponent's king in a mating net, win the game, and become famous for yet another impossible victory. No less impressive is the game between Vladimir Kramnik and Garry Kasparov in London during the World Championship match in the early 2000s. Kasparov started the game aggressively, and by the middle of the board, it seemed he had complete control, but Kramnik executed a brilliant defensive plan, an unexpected knight move, a sacrifice of the exchange, and a transition into a complex endgame. At that moment, commentators said that Kramnik was hanging by a thread. However, in defense, he found the only path to salvation and the game ended in a draw. For many viewers, it was a masterclass in survival chess, where patience and precision come to the forefront. Another incredible story took place in the early 2000s between Magnus Carlsen and Sergei Karjakin. At a critical moment for Carlsen, his rooks were completely blocked. All chances of victory seemed lost. But the Norwegian grandmaster knew how to capitalize even on the tiniest mistakes of his opponent. On the 31st move, he offered an exchange that outwardly appeared inaccurate but ultimately led to an unexpected counterattack. Over the next 10 moves, Carlsen almost single-handedly took control of the entire board and snatched victory right from under his opponent's nose. It's also worth recalling the game between Anatoly Karpov and Garry Kasparov at the World Championship in the latter half of the 80s. Karpov, known for his ability to wait out his opponent's mistakes, managed to save himself from almost hopeless positions several times. In one of the key games, he was down a piece, but found a series of precise moves that allowed him to steer the game into a drawn position. The commentators were stunned. It seemed as if Karpov himself could see 8 or even 10 moves ahead, not giving his opponent the slightest chance. Games like these become chess legends. After all, it is precisely in moments of despair and impossibility that the boldest ideas are born. But where do masters get such abilities, and how do they control their minds under pressure? The answer lies in incredible psychological mastery, which is rarely revealed to the public. When it seems that there are no resources left on the board, true champions activate their main invisible tool's psychological techniques that their opponents don't even notice until the very last moment. Like a seasoned card shark, they hide their intentions until the very end, controlling not only the pieces but also their opponent's thinking. Imagine Garry Kasparov at the board not looking into his opponent's eyes, but as if looking right through them, deliberately making slow, unhurried moves, causing his opponent to doubt the correctness of every idea. Once, during a final match, Kasparov spent almost 40 minutes on a single move, while his opponent began to get nervous, thinking the grandmaster was calculating a brilliant trap. In reality, Kasparov had already made up his mind long before. He simply wanted to make sure his opponent would be thrown off their usual rhythm, make a mistake, or at least stop noticing the traps Kasparov had set 10 moves earlier. Anatoly Karpov acted no less masterfully. He could conduct the game very slowly, without any visible threats, but in such a way that his opponent would start to get nervous, try to force events, and as a result, end up putting himself in a losing position. Karpov would deliberately make unhurried moves with his pieces, feigning uncertainty, and by doing so would provoke his opponent to attack too early, forgetting about defense. In the final of the international tournament in Baguio in the late 80s, Karpov gained his advantage precisely through such psychological nuances. His opponent committed his bishop to the attack too early and lost control of the center of the board. In the game between Magnus Carlsen and Viswanathan Anand, the Norwegian champion employed an even more sophisticated technique. He deliberately took his time on simple moves, creating the illusion of fatigue or distraction. At some point, Anand decided that Carlsen was about to make a mistake and went for a risky queen exchange. But it all turned out to be an act. Soon, Carlsen began to play with lightning speed, as if he already knew all the answers in advance. His unexpected pace threw his opponent off balance. Anand was unprepared for such speed, and within just 5 moves lost decisive material. Even in his youth, Bobby Fischer was famous for deliberately creating tense pauses and demanding absolute silence and calm in the playing hall. Once, in a match against Tigran Petrosyan, Fischer refrained from making a move for a long time, ignoring the obvious solution. When his opponent's patience was already at its limit, Fischer suddenly made the most unexpected move, causing Petrosyan, thrown off balance, to immediately make a mistake and lose a piece. Fischer had an excellent sense of when psychological pressure began to have a greater effect than even the threat of checkmate. Another trick often used by grandmasters is the so-called masking thinking. During a game, Ian Nepomniachtchi in one of the Blitz championships maintained a completely impassive face even in critical moments. The opponent assumed that Ian had everything under control and refrained from risky moves that could have objectively led to victory. Only after the game did Nepomniachtchi reveal that, in reality, he was close to panic, but not a single muscle twitched. Such composure often proves to be decisive. However, psychological techniques are not always so subtle. Veselin Topalov, once faced with an especially aggressive opponent's style at a tournament in St. Louis, started making his moves deliberately quickly, as if to prove that he saw everything already and was not surprised by anything. His opponent began to mimic this pace, which meant he simply didn't have time to think through complex variations. By the 30th move, the game had turned into a marathon of mistakes, which Topalov easily won all thanks to the skillfully organized pressure. Let's not forget about teamwork either. Some champions work with psychologists specifically to train their stress resilience. For example, in his youth, Magnus Carlsen repeatedly attended emotional management sessions and even trained against computer programs designed to create the most stressful situations possible at the board. This allowed him to remain completely calm even when his opponent tried to throw him off balance. This approach paid off. In World Championship matches, Carlsen has repeatedly managed to hold draws in hopeless positions without faltering for a second. The psychological battle on the chessboard takes place alongside the clash of pieces, and often it is this battle that determines the outcome of the game. But behind the cold exterior and mastery of emotional control, there is always another secret tool of champions, one that begins in their training process. It is there that they study traps, analyze their mistakes, and come up with those very moves that their opponent would never expect to see, even in the most complicated situations. If you have ever watched Grandmaster games, you may have noticed that sometimes their defeats happen because of the most frustrating detail, a hidden trap that the opponent set up in advance. But more often, it is they who create such webs, ensnaring even experienced masters. In the world of chess, a trap does not necessarily look like a classic trick involving the sacrifice of a pawn or a piece. Sometimes it's a real spectacle of precise moves, where the opponent doesn't see the main threat until the very last moment. One of the most famous traps occurred in the late 1990s when Viswanathan Anand faced Garry Kasparov. In the middle of the game, Anand confidently led his pieces into the attack, but Kasparov practically invited his opponent into his own camp, making it appear as if there was an easy piece sacrifice. As soon as Anand took the bait, a series of forced moves followed, and in less than 5 moves, he found himself in Zugzwang. Each move only worsened his position, and Kasparov quickly won the game. But true geniuses are able to hide traps deeper than even a computer can calculate. In a match between Magnus Carlsen and Levon Aronian in the early 2000s, the Norwegian champion executed one of the boldest tactical feints. Aronian, sensing a positional advantage, prepared to launch a powerful attack on the king side. But Carlsen, seemingly unflustered, made the simplest defensive moves. Everything changed on the 27th move. Carlsen offered an innocent-looking knight exchange, which opened a file for his rook and created the double threat to his opponent's queen and pawn. Aronian was forced to sacrifice material to avoid immediate checkmate, and the game ended in Carlsen's victory, even though just a minute earlier all the experts believed he was headed for defeat. A special place among chess traps is held by the so-called opening tricks. When Bobby Fischer played his famous Sicilian defense, he often provoked his opponents into launching aggressive attacks on the queen side, only to suddenly shift the pressure to the king side on the 11th or 12th move. In his game against Mikhail Tal, Fischer feigned an invisible threat on the queen side and forced Tal to waste 2 moves defending a pawn that was never actually under attack. By the time Tal realized that the entire combination was just a distraction, Fischer had already launched a powerful attack on the opposite side of the board. Within 6 moves, Tal's king was trapped, and the outcome of the game was already decided. Sometimes a real trap is constructed from a series of innocent-looking moves, each of which seems simple and even dull on its own. For example, in a game against Vaclav Lagrave in the mid-2000s, Ian Nepomniachtchi played in such a way that his opponent thought the game was heading for a draw. Ian maneuvered his knight, sacrificing one pawn after another, while Vaclav Lagrave collected them, unaware that each pawn opened a new line for Nepomniachtchi's pieces. And just 7 moves later, the Black King was left completely defenseless. Having lost all protection simply because a few moves earlier, it seemed as if nothing was happening. In some cases, traps are created through unconventional calculation of variations. Anatoly Karpov, renowned for his ability to ensnare opponents in positional webs, once played a game against Jan Timman where he assigned his pieces incredibly passive roles. Everyone thought that Karpov was making mistake after mistake. However, on the 22nd move, he sacrificed his rook and immediately trapped his opponent's queen in a bizarre net. After this combination, Timman was forced to resign literally 3 moves later, since at that time, not a single computer could foresee this threat in advance. In the world of chess, invisible threats are especially valued when a grandmaster devises a plan from the very beginning of the game that is only realized at the very end. Magnus Carlsen, in his game against Fabiano Caruana in St. Louis in the early 2000s, started with classic moves in the English opening, without making any of his favorite aggressive attacks. Visually, there was complete calm on the board. The pieces hardly left their original squares, but on the 18th move, Carlsen unexpectedly sacrificed a pawn and created a hidden battery of bishops. Caruana, thinking he was winning material, soon realized that he had fallen into a positional trap from which it was almost impossible to escape. 3 more moves, and the game ends in Carlsen's favor, who remained completely unflappable the entire time. But to create such traps, grandmasters spend hours every day working on tactics and studying the games of past masters in detail. They analyze not only their victories but also their defeats to understand how their opponent was able to see what remains hidden to the average chess player. Let's move on to how the world's best chess players learn, train and draw lessons even from their most unsuccessful moves. Professional chess players learn from childhood to analyze their games the way doctors study complex cases with a magnifying glass and minute by minute. Magnus Carlsen, for example, was already analyzing every tournament he played before the age of 12, not only with his coach but also on his own, spending hours replaying in his mind the moments where he might have made a mistake. After major defeats, his father would organize entire review sessions with him, where Carlsen would repeat the same position over and over until he found the correct move. In his childhood, he was shown games by masters such as Mikhail Botvinnik and Garry Kasparov, and was made to reproduce every decision on the board down to the smallest detail. Even then, Carlsen got used to not just watching how the pieces developed, but always asking himself, why was this move the best in this particular situation? Anatoly Karpov, who became world champion at a young age, says that he turned every tournament into homework. His coach would give him the task of finding at least 3 mistakes in his games, regardless of the result. After each game, Karpov would not go to the lounge, but back to the board, and together with his coach, he would challenge himself to search for alternative moves. Sometimes the analysis would last longer than the game itself. If a critical mistake was found, Karpov had to come up with ways to prevent it from happening again and immediately play a similar position against his coach anew. Bobby Fischer was known for his particular obsession. He didn't just analyze his own games, but would spend hours studying the classics. He kept collections of games by Morphy, Alekhine and Lasker at hand even while traveling. Already as a teenager, Fischer would record games from memory and replay them in front of a mirror, playing both himself and his opponent. After his own defeats, he would consult with the strongest coaches in America to understand every miscalculation. When he found a mistake, he wouldn't rest until he found a way to rewrite the course of the game with the perfect solution. Thanks to this kind of practice, Fischer became a master at finding unconventional moves in the most difficult situations. Ian Nepomniachtchi, one of the best tacticians of our time, uses modern technology. After each tournament, he and his team upload all the games into special software that analyzes even the smallest inaccuracies. This analysis is carried out literally for every single move. If the program shows a yellow rating, the team restarts the analysis until they fully understand the nature of the mistake. Then Ian repeats these positions during training, playing against different partners to reinforce the skill of spotting traps in advance. Vladimir Kramnik's method is even more interesting. He advises young chess players to analyze not only their losses but also their draws. According to him, drawn games often hide missed opportunities for victory. As a child, Kramnik would specifically model games in which he narrowly escaped defeat, in order to learn not only how to save himself, but also how to seize the initiative. Hundreds of repetitions of the same positions helped him develop intuition, when to take risks and when it's better to defend. Grandmasters often discuss game analysis with each other. After tournaments, in super grandmaster circles, closed postmortems are held, where masters sit at the board and replay all the key moments, offering alternative solutions. For example, after the legendary game between Carlsen and Karjakin, the masters gathered the entire hall and spent almost 3 hours debating possible variations on the 30th move. Karjakin claimed that he could have won with a single risky queen move, but analysis showed that Carlsen had calculated everything perfectly, and the trap was set masterfully. Working with databases holds a special place. From as young as 7 or 8 years old, young talents are shown huge archives of games, given exercises like find the champion's mistake, and the child must figure out on which move a different result could have been achieved. Magnus Carlsen applied this principle even to his simplest games. If he won too easily, he would make things harder for himself by deliberately making mistakes, so he could learn how to correct them. At club training sessions, future champions often play blindfolded, meaning they keep the entire game in their heads without looking at the board. This method forces the brain to notice even the slightest deviation from the plan. Ian Nepomniachtchi said that it was precisely these training sessions that helped him quickly find unconventional continuations in extreme situations, when time was running out. Analyzing other people's mistakes also plays an important role. For example, in his youth, Garry Kasparov collected a compilation of the best grandmasters' failures and analyzed them on the board with his coach. He believed that every loss by another master was not just a story, but a ready-made warning for himself. Thanks to this, Garry learned not to fall for standard tactical traps that are disguised as harmless exchanges. Even as an adult, he personally analyzed the games of his future opponents, noting their favorite moves and weaknesses. This approach builds an immunity to mistakes that prove fatal for others. By studying and replaying their own defeats, chess stars create their own database of errors, so that in the most intense moments they can find salvation where an ordinary player would already give up. But the key to their phenomenal foresight lies not only in analyzing mistakes, but also in their incredible calculation coordination, where every move is made with the entire path to checkmate in mind. When it seems that grandmasters can read their opponent's mind, the secret is not magic at all, but rather the remarkable harmony and precision of their calculations. For a champion, every move is not just the relocation of a piece, but an entire chain of interconnected decisions, where the opponent's response is calculated 3, 5, or sometimes even 8 to 10 moves ahead. For example, when Garry Kasparov was preparing for his match against Anatoly Karpov in the mid-1980s, he studied not only Karpov's openings but also his favorite pawn center structures, so he could devise plans in advance to dismantle those setups. During training, he would specifically play out with his assistants the very same positions that Karpov most often chose in tournaments, noting through which sequences Karpov tended to transition into attack or, on the contrary, into defense. Such coordination is also excellently demonstrated in rapid play. During a blitz tournament in Berlin in the late 2000s, Magnus Carlsen used an unconventional piece setup that looked extremely passive at first glance. While most spectators thought that Carlsen had simply given up the initiative, Magnus himself was thinking through not only his own moves, but also the ideal sequence of moves for his opponent. On the 7th move, his opponent tried to launch an attack on the queen side, but Carlsen, as if anticipating this maneuver, immediately shifted the game to the center, and within just 4 moves, gained a decisive positional advantage. It turned out that his entire passive plan had included a trap from the very beginning, into which his opponent walked step by step on his own. The well-known Soviet analyst Mark Dvoretsky recounted that even back in Mikhail Botvinnik's days, future champions were taught to construct entire trees of variations in their minds. In every training session, they were given a position with the requirement not just to find a move, but to predict the opponent's response and prepare at least 2 alternatives to it. If one of them didn't work, the young chess player had to immediately switch to another line without wasting any time. This approach led to Botvinnik, in his game against David Bronstein in the early 1950s, calculating the entire king attack combination 9 moves ahead and executing it without giving his opponent a chance to escape. Modern champions use analytical databases to study their opponents. Ian Nepomniachtchi prepared for his match against Magnus Carlsen with a program that collected thousands of the Norwegian's games. He noted in which openings Carlsen most often made aggressive moves and where he preferred to defend. In one of the training matches, his partners deliberately played 30 games, copying Carlsen's favorite setups. Nepomniachtchi clearly identified which group of moves made his opponent think longer than usual, and built his strategy to steer the game toward those positions during the championship. As a result, he achieved several draws and even one victory in the official series. All this was thanks to the coordinated preparation and the ability to anticipate the opponent's responses in advance. An interesting incident occurred at the candidates tournament in Candy Duel at the end of the 60s. Viktor Korchnoi, while analyzing his opponent, discovered recurring patterns. His opponent most often attacked along the same diagonal whenever he felt pressure on the king side. Korchnoi devised a tactic where he practically lured his opponent into this pattern. And as soon as his opponent launched the usual attack, Korchnoi was already prepared to offer a queen exchange, after which the game transitioned into an endgame that was winning for him. This turn of events was unexpected, as the opponent had no idea that his strategy had already been factored into Korchnoi's calculations in advance. Another example of remarkable foresight is the game between Vladimir Kramnik and Veselin Topalov in Elista in the mid-2000s. Kramnik, renowned for his ability to play on the fine edges of positional chess, had analyzed Topalov's style in advance, noting that he preferred to control the files with his heavy pieces. On the 15th move, Kramnik deliberately allowed a rook exchange to alter the pawn structure. It turned out that Topalov was unprepared for such a move. Just 3 moves later, he lost an important central pawn and the initiative shifted entirely to Kramnik. This episode demonstrated how important it is to consider not only the position itself, but also the psychological and strategic habits of your opponent. Grandmasters are able to calculate the consequences of their decisions many moves ahead thanks to daily training in memory and analysis. In his youth notes, Bobby Fischer remarked, "If you can't see your opponent's reply at least 4 moves ahead, you risk falling into the simplest trap." That's why, when preparing to face Petrosian in the World Championship in the late 60s, Fischer would spend hours analyzing the Armenian Grandmaster's games and even memorize the sequence of his defensive moves. A few years later, at one of the tournaments, Fischer played the same position and, already knowing how Petrosian would respond to the provocation, launched a sharp attack that led to victory. Coordination and calculation do not end at the opening stage. Such skills are especially important in the endgame. Anatoly Karpov, in the final match in Seville in the late 80s against Garry Kasparov, while being down in material, constantly repeated the same pattern-making and equalizing move and immediately calculating not only the direct response, but also all the unpopular rare moves his opponent might make. On the 30th move, when it seemed that Karpov would lose the pawn endgame, he managed to seize the initiative and the game ended in a draw. All because Karpov had prepared defensive responses in advance against all possible moves by Kasparov. Magnus Carlsen's team includes not only coaches, but also special analysts who simulate matches against his future opponents for him. Before his match with Fabiano Caruana in St. Louis, they played out 100 games in a wide variety of openings, noting at which moves Caruana most often changes his plans. Carlsen memorized these turning points, and when it came to the actual match, he was able to take advantage of his opponent's hesitations, gaining the upper hand in a key game. That's why grandmasters lose so rarely. Their preparation is based not only on tactics, but also on a mystical, almost absolute harmony of thought. Every move is the result of tremendous work in analysis, calculation, and anticipating the opponent's ideas, which turns a chess game into a battle of minds, where each piece's movement is already a reflection of future events on the board.